be seated. It's kind of interesting. We actually have two retired lieutenant colonels here tonight. One is Alan West, retired from the United States Army. And Tony Perkins thinks it's a joke to have me introduce the Marine. But I will do that. And I will do that because he is a very dear friend of mine. You all know our next guest, our next speaker. He's a 1968 graduate of the Naval Academy at Annapolis. He was commissioned in the Marine Corps. Went off to Vietnam, where he served as a platoon commander and was awarded a Silver Star for his heroism there. As you know the story, that Ollie went on to serve in the White House in the Reagan administration as part of the National Security Council. He pulled off some pretty good operations there. And then ultimately, he spent a little bit of time before the Congress defending the Reagan policies. But after he retired, he founded the Freedom Alliance, which is, I'm on the board of that, and I'm very proud to be. And it is an incredible organization that takes care of wounded warriors as well as their families, to include putting them in houses, getting homes for them, and putting them in. He is right now, he has an incredible program called War Stories. I hope that you all watch that. I think it's on the Fox Business News, but it is just an incredible piece of history, and he does a lot of research on that. But he also does a lot of traveling back into the Middle East, Iraq, and occasionally Afghanistan, and he's been doing a lot of work with the Kurds. And he is he's a little bit of a hunter. He's not as good as I am, but I tell you, some of our best quality time is spent in a cold morning in a goose blind in the eastern shore of Maryland. He is a wonderful friend, and it's my privilege to introduce you to someone that needs no introduction, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North.
Uncle Sam put your name at the top of his list, and the Statue of Liberty started shaking her fist.
Thank you all. Thank you, General Boykin. It is always a pleasure to be introduced by a real American hero, and he is. You're blessed to have him as the number 2 here at FRC. I want to just remind you, if I may, about an anniversary that's occurring on Sunday, because it sets the predicate for the things that ought to be important in the days ahead. It was 15 years ago, this next Sunday, when 19 deeply committed young men boarded 4 commercial airliners with the intention of killing themselves and as many of us and our countrymen as possible. They succeeded beyond anyone's imagination. Watch this.
Takeoffs at all airports across America.
A wire now saying another aircraft, unbelievably, has crashed into the Pentagon.
How does it make us safer? Yet that's a question, for whatever reason, none of my colleagues in the so-called mainstream media have asked. They've asked the current commander-in-chief, who 3 weeks ago sent 15 more, leaving just 61 left at Guantanamo, to include those faces you just saw. We know that one of our presidential candidates what he's planning to do about Guantanamo. We don't know about the others because my colleagues have not asked. How does closing Guantanamo make us safer? If the thousands of interviews that I've done since 9/11/01 are a valid measure, everyone here can recall how they learned, where they were, what they were doing, and who they were with when they saw that occur. I've interviewed over the years of doing war stories scores of Pearl Harbor survivors, and I still ask all the World War II veterans that I interviewed for those 50 episodes that dealt with World War II, what were you doing when you learned about Pearl Harbor? And they could all tell me, and many of them were in their late 80s, early 90s. And you'll be able to do that as well. I would submit the people running our government today have forgotten. I know where I was. I was on a flight, Northwest Airlines Flight 239, coming from Detroit to land at Reagan Airport, due to land at 8:55. We were a little bit late. As you come down from the northern approach into Reagan National Airport, you jink down the Potomac River, trying to avoid the buildings in Roslyn on the right and the federal area off to the left, which is off limits. And so the flaps are down, the wheels are down, and suddenly as the airplane is on the final approach, it jerks up very quickly. The pilot comes on and says, "We have an emergency." Banks hard to the right, puts the wheels up, puts the flaps up, and out the left window where I was sitting, I was on the aisle, the gentleman next to me looks like he's having a heart attack. I thought he was having a heart attack, so I reached over and said, "Are you all right?" And he simply pointed out the window, and you could just see the plume of the smoke and the fire from the airplane that just struck the west wall of the Pentagon. Since that day, America has been at war. It's a war we did not want, it is a war we did not provoke, and it has tested the courage and perseverance of our nation. Why did it start? I would submit to you here this evening that it started because radical Islamists decided they could take advantage of what they perceived as America's weakness. In the 1990s, our commander-in-chief, the husband of one of the candidates who shall remain nameless, William Jefferson Blythe Clinton, his full name. He was reaping the benefits of Ronald Reagan having ended the Cold War. And so he decided to cut U.S. defense and intelligence budgets as a peace dividend. Then he embroiled Americans in the carnage of Kosovo, those who died in Mogadishu because of too little support, and let Rwanda become a genocide. He did nothing but waste scores of good Tomahawk missiles in Sudan and Afghanistan in a flaccid effort to stop Osama bin Laden's plotting and planning for 9/11/01. And then for good measure, he sent his Secretary of State, none other than Maddy Albright, to negotiate the end of North Korea's nuclear weapons program. For those of you who have seen the news today, you have evidence as to how effective that's been since they cracked off the very first successful miniaturized warhead. Some success. After 15 long years of war, in just 59 days, we, the people, are going to hire a new commander-in-chief. We'll hire 34 U.S. senators and all 435 members of the U.S. House of Representatives in what may well be the most important election of my life for me, my children, and my 17 grandchildren. My only beat at Fox News are soldiers, sailors, airmen, guardsmen, Marines, and first responders. For the last 15 years and 58 embeds, Fox has let me keep company with heroes. This is what they look like from some footage that we shot over these thousands of hours of embeds in the difficult and dangerous things that they do and the places where they do it. Now, some think of a hero as one who catches a pass in the end zone or perhaps sets a new record in the Olympics, climbs a mountain, wears a spandex suit and a cape. But my heroes wear flak jackets and dog tags and helmets and flight suits and combat boots, and they go to work in the most difficult, dangerous places on earth. The classical definition of a hero is a person who puts themselves at risk for the benefit of others, and that certainly defines those with whom I've kept company for this last decade and a half. My job is to let them tell their stories without telling the enemies things they shouldn't know. Since 9/11, the best and bravest of a generation, 2.7 million young Americans have volunteered to protect us and offer others the hope of freedom. Most of them have committed multiple deployments, and they've seen gross, horrible things like you see on the screen right here. This is the remains of an entire Christian village in the Nineveh Plain of northern Iraq. Today it is 115 degrees in Iraq, it's 103 degrees in Afghanistan, and the enemies that our troops face are still vicious, brutal, and often suicidal. They can operate and maintain the most sophisticated weapons and equipment in the world, and most important, since the very first time America went to war against a foreign adversary, the American Revolution, every single person serving is a volunteer. Those who serve in today's military are remarkable. Today's troops are brighter, better educated, trained, led, and equipped, and more combat experienced than any military force in history. They become the protectors of Muslim women and children in a part of the world where that's a strange idea. I want to just show you a couple of examples. Some of you have seen this before, but this is really important. That's an example of what happens when they know they're going into a brutal combat existence and they're about to mount up on those helicopters you see behind the screen, and they know that they're not going out in a football field. They're going into mortal danger against an enemy who intends to die trying to kill them. It's unlike anything we've seen since World War II in the Pacific. What you see there is an example of faith that's not staged. There's a young Lance Corporal, and if you look off to the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see a dog. And the reason they're kneeling in prayer is because the dog's name is Dexter, and the dog handler's name is Smitty. And they've just joined this team because this is the assault wave going into a place called Marja, which was the largest concentration of Taliban and Al-Qaeda at that point in the war in Afghanistan. And what the Lance Corporal said is, hey, Smitty and Dexter are going with us. They'll be the first ones off the bird. And I always get off after the dog. I know the dog's a better detector than anything we've ever invented. And if the dog walked there, I'm going to follow the dog right in his footsteps. And they kneel and pray for Smitty and Dexter because they know that's going to keep them alive. This administration would say those government employees better not be praying on government time. And the next commander-in-chief had better change that kind of posture. And some of you have seen this last slide too. This was taken on the 6th of April, 2003, and I was embedded with Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, and they're ambushed by a Republican Guards regiment, about 700 of the best of what Saddam had, many of whom are undoubtedly now in ISIS. And what you see happening is a corpsman. You see the troops rushing into the gunfight. Baghdad is the smoke you see in the background. 3 days after this, we were in Baghdad. And what's happened is in the gunfight, they've spun the vehicles around to give them a little more offset from what the enemy was firing at them, and that's RPGs and 50 caliber machine guns. And now the troops are running forward into the gunfight, and the corpsman is carrying wounded guys off the battlefield. And what I didn't see is, as you look at the screen off to the left-hand side, is a Reuters news crew that showed up and starts documenting it. I'm on the ramp of the helicopter because I had just been talking to this corpsman. By the way, that's corpsman, not corpsman. I'd just been talking to the corpsman just before the gunfight, and he's still got Mr. Murdoch's microphone jammed down into his flak jacket. I need the microphone back. So I've run with him into the gunfight, run with him backwards. If you notice, that's not one guy, it's not four guys carrying one, which is common on a litter. This is one U.S. Navy medical corpsman who's about 6'4" and tough as a horse, carrying wounded guys off the battlefield. This is the fourth casualty. The bird is now taking hits, and the crew chief is yelling, "We've got to go." There's a shock trauma team aboard the CH-46 helicopter. And as he runs up with this last one, if you look at it carefully, that's not a wounded Marine. That is a wounded Republican Guardsman. U.S. military battle dressings on his leg and his head and his back. He's badly wounded. He's probably shot at a few helicopters, but he's never ridden in one before, and he's about to get a ride to one of the best hospitals on the planet, a U.S. Army field hospital about 10 kilometers behind the advance. And as the helicopter leaves, all the gunfire shifts toward the helicopter, and you can actually hear the Reuters news crew shout out, "Hey, mate, what did you do that for? Didn't you notice that was an Iraqi?" In other words, you stupid American. Because this is a polite crowd, I can only describe it this way. The corpsman looks at them, gives them a gesture, and shouts back at him, "Didn't you notice?" And if he hadn't used the expletives, we'd still be using this on Fox News. "Didn't you notice he was wounded? That's what we do, bleepers." Got it. That's what we do. We're Americans. These youngsters have all made extraordinary sacrifices for him, and they deserve a lot better than a commander-in-chief like the one they've got, garbed as a Nobel laureate, kowtowing to foreign potentates and apologizing for America. We need a commander-in-chief who knows this country is the greatest force for good the world has ever known, and for which we have nothing to apologize. The most important purpose of our government is to protect our homeland and the American people. And yet, the supposed leaders in Washington continue to fail in their primary mission, and our vulnerability increases by the day. The graphic images of American civilians being brutally tortured and murdered by ISIS are broadcast around the world. Our head of state promises that they are criminals that will be brought to justice, but nothing is done. Here at home, law officers, military personnel, and their dependents have been specifically targeted by radical Islamist organizations for murder in this country. In the last 3 months, radical Islamists have killed over 1,000 in the United States, France, Belgium, Egypt, the Philippines, and nearly 40 other countries besides Syria and Iraq. In the midst of all this, POTUS, as he calls himself, describes ISIS as contained, and he's now sent Secretary of State Kerry at this very minute to negotiate in Geneva with Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov on, I quote, putting ISIS in a box. I'm sorry, he doesn't say ISIS, he calls it ISIL. Everybody else in the world calls it ISIS, and most people who know what's going on don't limit it to ISIS. It is radical Islam that is the enemy. They're the ones that declared war on us. The only force to defeat ISIS are the Kurdish Peshmerga. They've consistently done so without any U.S. help for the last 3 years. Our enemies aren't criminals or extremists. Our enemies are radical Islamic jihadis, and they use trade names like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Al-Shabaab, Jamaat Islamiyah, Abu Sayyaf, Hezbollah, Hamas, and a host of other names. Some are Sunni, some are Shiite, some derive support from Arab entities, others from Persians. No matter the sobriquet, they are one in their objective, to destroy the United States of America and our ally, Israel. For 7.5 years, the O-Team, that's what I call it, the O-Team. The O-Team in Washington has coddled radical Islamists and battered Israel. They've done so little for so long, Putin actually put a combined arms brigade in Syria to save his ally, Assad. Obama has increased our jeopardy with all his ill-conceived nuclear weapons deal with Tehran's vicious ayatollahs. Instead of exploiting the gains made by American soldiers, sailors, airmen, guardsmen, and Marines, the administration squandered the blood and treasure expended in liberating both Iraq and Afghanistan. The O-Team's abysmal record of appeasement has emboldened our enemies, endangered our allies, and increased the risk to the American people here at home. The Obama-Clinton legacy is genocide in the Middle East, where ancient Christian communities and Yazidis are being obliterated. Over 250,000 unarmed men, women, and children have already perished in the civil war that's most uncivil in Syria and by ISIS. Radical Islamists have driven more than 60 million human beings from their homes in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Lebanon, Somalia, Ethiopia, Kenya, Nigeria, and Mali. The catastrophic numbers of dead and wounded and displaced, the largest since World War II, has overwhelmed all efforts to stop. The troops I've been covering now for these last 15 years are stunned at this outcome of the sacrifice that they've made. They raised their hands to fight radical Islam. They deserve a commander-in-chief who is as courageous as they are to take apart what's happened in Washington over the last 15 years. And I can say this with some experience, because he sent me off to war. Since Lyndon Baines Johnson, no generation of American troops has been sent into harm's way by political leaders so unwilling to define the enemy or what matters most, victory. Couldn't do it then, and they're not doing it now. Tells you something about this claque, this crowd. The brave patriots I've covered have better understanding of America's place and purpose in the world than Washington's political elites. They're my heroes, willing to fight and die for me and you and our freedom. And we all ought to demand in 59 days a commander-in-chief worthy of that kind of sacrifice. That's important. Those who serve in our nation's uniform require that we, the people, hire a commander-in-chief dedicated to the defense of our liberty and our homeland. Between now and November 8th, we, the people, need to ask every candidate for federal office, what would they do to defend this nation? We have to elect those who are committed to overcoming our leadership deficit disorder and the utopian rush toward unilateral disarmament. Our next commander-in-chief ought to be trusted by our allies and respected or even feared by our adversaries. Yet our allies in this increasingly dangerous world continue to be denied needed support. The brave Kurds that I've covered in northern Iraq are willing to fight. They're the only force that's consistently defeated ISIS. I'm about to show you some very graphic video of what they face in this fight, using weapons, get this, that we gave to the Baghdad government, that the Baghdad government surrendered to ISIS, and that the Kurds had to fight to get themselves. This is an ISIS suicide attack against the Peshmerga unit with which we were embedded in November. It's only 17 seconds long. The Peshmerga battalion commander is going to be at the bottom of the screen. Some of you are going to recognize the different sounds of incoming and outgoing rounds. Look carefully because it happens quickly. What you heard is the battalion commander shouting at me to get down in Kurdish, which I don't speak, but I did run out of videotape. Actually, it's little chips in our helmet cameras. The next commander-in-chief that we have has to support brave allies like these. He has to know the purpose of a strong military. Our military only exists for these purposes. Listen carefully. It exists to deter war and win a war if you have to fight it. That's the only reason we have it. It's not for foreign adventures. It's not for gold or colonial conquest or oil. Those are the purposes for which we have a military, clearly misunderstood by this administration. The legacy of this administration is a nuclear weapons deal with Iran that guarantees the Ayatollahs in Tehran and the despotic regime in Pyongyang will continue to build nuclear weapons and the ICBMs to deliver them. Our allies in Europe, Israel, Seoul, Manila, Tokyo no longer count on us. You know what the answer was today from the White House when a nuclear weapon is blown up? The first success that they've really had, a miniaturized warhead in Pyongyang. We sincerely condemn this action. How many times have we heard that over this administration. Boy, there must be quaking in their shoes up in Pyongyang over that one. Our adversaries in radical Islam, Beijing, Moscow, Tehran, the People's Republic of Korea, and Hezbollah no longer respect or even fear us. And I want to be very specific when it comes to this. Our ally Israel, the only democracy in that part of the world, needs to know that the phrase, "we've got your back," is more than the slogan of a mattress company, because that's what it's become under this administration. Now, I just want Tony to know, and I cleared this with, because one of the challenges we have, of course, are the rules that govern 501c3s and 501c4s. So I've very carefully avoided the mention of any of the candidates. You notice that, their names. I didn't, did I? For those in the working for the IRS in the background, I didn't. I'm now going to. So get your recorder on. I was. My employer required me to come in and watch what was billed as a Commander-in-Chief Forum on the deck of the USS Intrepid in New York Harbor, moderated by Matt Lauer, one of my colleagues. Okay. During that discussion, he let go the following words. She uttered them 4 times. She did it that night and again the next morning, and I quote, "We are not putting ground troops into Iraq ever again, and we're not putting ground troops into Syria." The cheers that you heard didn't come from the crowd on the Intrepid. The cheers in the background you heard were coming from Baghdadi, the head of ISIS, the vicious mastermind behind all of these atrocities, from Vladimir Putin, Bashar al-Assad, the Ayatollahs in Tehran, the terror kingpins in Hezbollah and Hamas, and from the corridors of power in Pyongyang and Beijing. That's where the cheering was coming from. Because no person who is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of the United States, who aspires to be, ought ever to tell our enemies what we will not do. It should never have happened. In trying to clean it up, she said, the next day, and again today, that her experience as Secretary of State is all we need. But those statements about what we won't do prove all she knows about national security was learned first at the feet of her husband. You remember Rwanda, the genocide, Mogadishu, Kosovo, and now from Barack Obama. They too, Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, repeatedly told and tell our adversaries what we will not do, when we will pull out, and issued empty promises. Do we really want another president who informs despots and psychopaths and terrorists what America won't do in its own vital national security interests? I ask you that question. Good, because I hope and pray we'll never have another one. And I don't think another demographically significant commander-in-chief is what we need right now. We need a real leader. God bless you all, and thank you for being here tonight.
Sam put your name at the top of his list, and the Statue of Liberty started shaking her fist.